first off, I'd like to thank Michael Murphy for organizing today. What an incredible gathering. Thank you, Michael. It's really a joy and honor to be here. I'm Spencer Bailey. I'm the founder of the New York-based media company, The Slowdown, and host of the time-sensitive podcast. As I hope will become somewhat clear during this conversation, I'm also a writer, editor, journalist who's deeply interested in memorials, memory, time, architecture, and Noguchi. In 2020, I published a book titled In Memory of Designing Contemporary Memorials that charts 40 years of memorial making from Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial to Mass Design Group's Gun Violence Memorial. And I'd like to first also welcome our three panelists, the scholar, writer, artist, chef, and creative director, Greg Thompson, on my near left, the strategist, leadership architect, experience designer, and Axel Impact Studio founder, Della Wilson, and the architect, memorial designer, and Handel Architects partner, Michael Arad. Welcome. So I wanted to begin the conversation just by sort of entering this memorial space, let's call it, through your individual stories and how each of you respectively found your way into this world of memorial making. So Della, let's start with you.
Sure. So I came into this by happenstance. I did not grow up imagining myself to work in memorialization. But I knew that my work, being raised by civil rights activists and an educator in the rural South, I knew that my work would be to reckon with and support Black lives. And how that manifested over my career has shifted, first as a lawyer, then moving into policy school, moving into strategy. And as I worked with communities and kind of between community and government to figure out how do we navigate post-colonial development, how do we navigate repositioning systems to benefit specifically Black and brown folks at the international level, memorialization and reparations continue to come to bear. And so it became that my work in reparations lent itself to memorialization as one of the main tenets of what does it mean to repair a broken society. We have to begin with an acknowledgement and an apology, and memorialization fits into that docket, but it's a yes and. And so met with Greg and the team about maybe almost 3 years ago at this point, and so have been honored to be a part of the team with the National Memorial for the Underground Railroad, and excited to talk about that with you all today.
Greg.
Hey, everybody. So I came at this obliquely and surprisingly. I'm a theologian and a civil rights historian. So I was at the University of Virginia, did a PhD on MLK, and so I was being formed to think about love. Specifically, I wrote about what he meant by love. But I'm also from South Carolina. I'm the descendant of Klan members. And the more I understood that we inhabit the longest standing white supremacist order in global history, and the more I understood my own implications in that, I began to ask the question, what does love require? What does love require in response to this? And I wrote a book on reparations. If you want to win a bunch of friends, that's the book to write. And so I wrote a book on reparations, and then I realized that one of the reasons that people were so non-responsive was not because they were opposed to giving money or sharing power, but because they couldn't imagine a world in which reparations was necessary. And so I thought, okay, I have to work at the level of the imagination. How do I do that? I got pulled into a project in Memphis, Claiborne Temple, the site of MLK's last march, with support role in the I Am a Man Plaza there, produced a musical there about MLK's last march. And then I went to Montgomery and saw the EGI Memorial, and I was like, this is what I want to do. And I had the opportunity, because of my work in Memphis, to get pulled into a emerging question about the Underground Railroad and how that story is told in the United States. And so I have been leading the project to design the National Memorial to the Underground Railroad for the past 7 years.
Thank you. And Michael?
I think, something Michael mentioned earlier is how spaces can have a profound impact on us emotionally. And I think that's something I felt as a child. And I recall places having like a deep emotional impact on me. I recall visiting the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in high school for the first time. Or when we lived in Mexico, going to Monte Alban and just the vastness of that space. And it just kind of, it resonated with me. It felt like there was meaning there. And like you, Della, I was supposed to go to law school, but somehow I managed to divert my path and ended up very much being drawn to architecture. And I think when it comes specifically to memorials, if you do one, you become an expert. But being in New York and witnessing what happened there on that day and in the weeks and months that followed very much pushed me to try and give form to the feelings that I had. And so that was my entry point to it.
Right. And I mean, this was a sort of Maya Lin moment in a way for you, being this, basically submitting an application to this competition with more than 1,000 entries. I mean, how many thousands of entries were there?
5,200, yeah. In part, I think what helped me is that I did not look at the rules that guided the competition too closely, because they felt very constrained. It was as if the master plan tried to impose what should happen here. And I thought about my experiences in New York and how, like, going to Washington Square Park a couple of nights after the attack and walking up to that fountain in the middle of the park late at night and standing next to strangers, but feeling a sense of community, really changed my understanding of my place in the world. I had never thought of myself as an American up until that moment, but I became connected to New York in a way that I hadn't anticipated. So that's what I wanted to bring to the project, was that sense of community. And to do that, I thought you had to have a normative public space, a place for people to gather. And so the master plan actually called for the entire site to be some 60 feet below the surrounding streets and sidewalks. And I thought, we have to bring everything up to grade to create a place that brings people in, that is part of the day-to-day life of New York City. That yes, it's a memorial, it's about the past, but it's really also about the present and the future. And how do we, and I think that's the thread that runs through my work, is that a memorial is really an act of building community and finding your identity is part of a much larger narrative that we're all engaged in.
Well, what I didn't say earlier is that my book makes a case for abstraction and metaphor when it comes to memorial making. And I made this case from a very personal standpoint, so I guess I'll just say here briefly, try to keep this brief, how and why I became fascinated with memorials. The very short version is that when I was 3.5 years old, just a month before my 4th birthday, I survived a commercial airline crash, United Airlines, Flight 232 in Sioux City, Iowa, and 285 people were on board, and 112, including my mom, died that day. I feel very lucky to be here, but when these moments of national or international trauma occur on a stage, as that did, there's always like a sort of visual or a moment after that occurs, and in the case of this crash, it was this one photograph in particular that ended up on the cover of the New York Times, Time magazine, all over CNN and newscasts, and it was a photo of me being carried. This very biblical sort of image almost. And 5 years after the crash, it was turned into a monument, a bronze statue on the riverfront in Sioux City, Iowa. And I basically grew up struggling to contend with what it means to be a survivor, what it means to be memorialized, what it means to be remembered in this way. And by the late 90s, when Google was on the rise, what it meant for people to Google your name and find that. So the book was a way of me, in a way, a roundabout way of me becoming a journalist, was taking my story back, and the book was a way to do that. And it was a way to do that in a global sense. Michael, your project's included in the book and was a big part of the book for me, because I think that memorial in so many different ways masterfully captures what I would describe as a polyvocal space, a space for many, a space where all these voices can be heard and felt. And it was a way to kind of understand what went wrong, in my opinion at least, with the monument that depicts me being carried. So with that, I wanted to, I guess let's first jump into the Underground Railroad project that you guys are working on. How did that initially come about? What's your hope and vision for it? Maybe each respectively talk about that.
Yeah, so I mentioned this musical that I produced in Memphis around MLK 50. A man from Pennsylvania came to that musical and then came in Memphis and then came again to the show in Winston-Salem and came to me and said, hey, I see what you're trying to do and I wonder if you are interested in the Underground Railroad. And I said, well, I'm more 20th century, I don't know a ton about it. Look, give me 6 months and I'll research your area and see if it makes sense. Now, I'm not kidding. His initial idea was to build an escape room. And I was like, America is an escape room. Like, we're not doing that. And so I said, I think that you don't know what's possible. So I realized that the area of Chester County, Pennsylvania, is to the Underground Railroad what, say, Selma and Montgomery are to the Civil Rights Movement. First 2 HBCUs in the United States. Everybody that you know of in the Underground Railroad has come through there. No large-scale memorials of any kind. And you also know that the Underground Railroad is told largely, often as either like Harriet Tubman or a white savior story. And especially in Pennsylvania, it's like a Quaker as savior story. And so I saw an opportunity, and I told this man, I said, why don't you meet me in Montgomery, and I'll show you what I think we should be thinking, the scale at which we should be thinking. And he came, and he was like, let's do it. So immediately, I realized we have 2 white dudes. This is not the way to proceed. So our first move was to go to Lincoln University, the nation's first degree-granting HBCU, which is in Chester County. Met with the president, began to meet with faculty for several years and just said, here's what we're thinking, here's what we see, what do you see? And that was really fruitful. We ended up asking the community for several years, like, do y'all think that this is a good idea? We started in March of 2020. We formally launched an organization. There were some other things going on in the world that time, which was great because what that allowed us to do was just to have a lot of video calls with people about this. We had a design conference in 2022 where we brought scholars and philanthropists and activists and artists together and descendants and said, like, hey, do you think this is a good idea? Because if not, like, let's don't do it. But if you do, what are the design principles that you would establish for this? And my responsibility, Michael was talking at his book event last night about the producer role. I don't really have any hard skills as far as I can tell, but what I can do is gather people and say, here's what I think we're trying to do. Can you all change it, make it better, grow it? And this is really how I met Della and her team at Room for Magic and some others who've been involved. So that's how I got involved.
Yeah, so I would add to that the National Memorial to the Underground Railroad and the point of which the memorial was conceptualized at the point that we came in took a posture that I think is a challenge for many memorial designers, where in the United States, we have some 50,000 public monuments. 0.5% of them are representative of people of color. 0.5%, less than 1%. And so the approach that we take to memorial design around a history that for some is very contentious, where we are needing to tell the truth that many to this day continue to deny. When you are bringing in a coalition of voices and perspectives of funders and institutions that are now defining and articulating that design, inherently you're going to face conflict because we are all starting at different points of understanding of our nation's history. And here we are now trying to memorialize that history and agree upon a story or collection of stories that are told through that monument process. And so what attracted me to this opportunity, not only because it was in its nascent state, had a commitment and a clear commitment to design principles that were truly inclusive and reflective of the community around them, but also recognized that the story of the Underground Railroad and the story of the transatlantic slave trade within the United States is a story of various perspectives. And so this monument is a 3-site experience that moves from Lincoln University to a vast landscape that's called Woodlawn Trust to a botanical garden space that has an existing tourist population and a beautiful grounds, but also holds history of Quaker cemeteries, and enslaved folks are buried on that ground as well. And each of these environments already exist within communities that are very different, and they attract very different communities. So what does it mean to create an arc of a story that is representative and reflective of those various environments while remaining centered on the Black self-emancipators' quest, commitment, sacrifice, relentlessness in the pursuit of freedom? And that is a complexity that I think oftentimes can get silenced if your design process isn't rooted in integrity. And kind of one of the larger conversations that we have as a design team is this role of an architect or an architectural design team in this storytelling, where it's not as simple to sketch an archetype. You are translating past and lived and future experiences that are directly informing policy. And I say that because memorialization, especially of Black and brown experiences in this country, cannot be separated from reparations. It is part of the reparations process. And so while you have a federal political agenda that's very hostile to reparations, you have many, many municipal agendas that are very much in support and progressing in that way. And where does the process of memorialization fit into, amplify, further progress, especially as this now becomes a centerpiece to the end of time and for generations to come?
Can I say one more thing on that?
Yeah.
That was so good. I think we think about this as reparations of truth. Remember, white supremacy didn't just steal money, it didn't just steal power, it stole truth about what's real. And so we have this 3-site memorial, Lincoln University, which has historic site, cemetery, was this powerful Black community that predated emancipation. We have Longwood Gardens, as Del just said. So this is the Lincoln University site. That's a church where Douglass preached. This is Longwood Gardens. That white home right there at the top, that's the Cox House, and it's just boarded up and closed. And then we have this Woodlawn Trust site, which allows you to essentially walk to the border. We've interestingly made this decision, which I didn't anticipate, that we're not going to cross the border. We're going to walk up from Delaware to the border and hopefully put an art installation on the other side that will allow this evocation of freedom. But we didn't want to give the idea of like, Harriet Tubman came and then Obama became president and everything is great. So this idea of the freedom still being something that we're gesturing toward. And the other thing I'll say is that in addition to building the site, we built the Center for Public History at Lincoln University because we wanted to center a Black institution. We launched that this year with a director and undergraduate scholars. And then we also are opening a restaurant. And the reason for that is part of the Underground Railroad was about hospitality and about the question of whether we welcome our neighbors or not. And we can either say, hey, this is a collaboration in this area between Quakers and African Americans, or we can put Quaker food and African American foodways on the same plate and let people taste that. So I've been working on this project for about 5 years. It opens next spring. Y'all should come. But it's called Star and Lantern. It's a cocktail bar. And I put a photo. There's the photo with the guy with the kind of gold around him. We're basing the cocktail menu on a guy named Tom Bullock, who was he published the first cocktail book by an African American in 1917 called The Ideal Bartender. So a lot of it is built on his work. That's the guy on the left. William Still's in the middle. And then we commissioned this 8-foot-tall portrait of Harriet Tubman by Patrick Doerr. This is amazing New York-based artist. Her robe is made out of passages from the book of Exodus. It's extraordinary. And it kind of presides over the whole scene. So the idea is to create an ecosystem of memory that itself could also contribute to a financial infrastructure that allows all of these things to proceed. So that I realize I didn't answer what we're hoping for. But in terms of the design, we don't know. We're still waiting to see. We just know we have these 3 sites and we want them to center self-emancipators and tell the truth.
As you were both talking, I love this phrase, ecosystem of memory, but as you were both talking, I was thinking about the Saidiya Hartman phrase, temporal entanglement, which to me feels like memorials are this rare place where you can really see that writ large in a very public way. It's almost like building time. which, Michael, I want to bring up that you're also, you spoke a bit about your reflecting absence at the 9/11 memorial, but I also wanted to bring up that you're working on a memorial to the victims of the Charleston church shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. So how does that process, what's that process been like? How does it compare to the experience you had in New York?
So at the very beginning, when they reached out to a few design teams, they didn't ask us to submit a design, but rather to write an essay, our understanding of the nature of forgiveness and the history of what happened at the site. And it felt, it was a different way to enter a project, and I think it was the right way, because the idea that you can begin with a design without actually having met your clients and having met the audience that is going to inhabit the space. I mean, I often think of what we do as almost like, setting the stage and then the actors come on. But our role is to welcome those actors onto the stage. But so what it did, it was an incredible set of conversations right at the very beginning. And but it also felt like you just had a blank page once you were selected, which was terrifying in its own way, because you kind of want to have a thread that you can pursue as a designer. And so for months after these conversations, some of them were sort of in larger groups, some in smaller groups, some with family members of the victims, some with members of the congregation. We had a hard time actually coming to a consensus once we did set pen to paper, so to speak, and came up with a few different directions that we pursued for a while and stepped back. And I actually was interested in figural representation initially, which I know you're not a huge fan of, but I thought that you had to know who the victims were when you came here, and suggested something. We would work with a sculptor, and there would be some sort of bas-relief, and you would see the actual faces of the victims. And it was actually members of the congregation, especially the pastor, who said, you're focusing too much on the nine. The nine are important to us. They were members of her congregation, but this congregation has a 200-year history, and it's about faith and about that story. And yes, it is also about the nine, but it can't be just about the elevation of those 9 people and letting everything else somehow fade into, the realm of forgotten memories. And what we ended up doing is coming up with a design. We presented many different ideas, which was really about creating a congregational space, a space that in many ways is an analog of the church just outside. It's about these 2 high-backed benches, almost like pews. We call them fellowship benches, that surround a fountain where the names of the 9 are inscribed. But it is really about creating a place of community. The other thing that for me was odd and difficult and challenging was, we are building on private property, on church grounds. And so we tried to create a place that was very public. We open onto Calhoun Street, of all names, and we welcome people in, but it is still very much part of the church. We were reframing the church grounds, and so here I find myself as an agnostic Jew working with the symbology that carries so much weight, like the cross, the altar, and using it very sparingly, but also kind of coming at it as an outsider to a great degree.
Well, I think both of these, or all of your answers kind of lead me to the next question, which is, how do you view the role of the designer in this? Obviously, you're the one who's sort of, in some sense, shaping the space, but it requires community involvement. It requires oftentimes institutional involvement. So I guess, where do you see the role of design in this conversation? And I'd actually be curious to hear you talk about that from the perspective of reflecting absence, because it's now you also now have the time to reflect on it and kind of see both the process of the making and then the life it lives after it's installed.
So on that project, I think there are a couple of really sort of guiding principles that were important to me when I started the process. And one that it'd be a communal space at grade, a public gathering place, and the other that we would find a way to mark absence. And the design evolved and changed over the 8-year period of design and construction. And some elements that had been incredibly important to me as a designer early on, and I thought we can't build this without them, were eliminated from the design. So for example, those waterfalls that you see ringing the void, in the initial design you could actually descend down and stand behind that waterfall and gaze through that veil of water out onto the city and past the names which would ring that. And it was one of those moments where you think, is this project lost altogether? But I think what I learned through the difficulties of that project is that as long as you can hold on to those most important foundational ideas and convince other people that those ideas are important and they can see the value in those ideas, something that is important to them too, you're able to hold on to what's important. I mean, throughout that process, it felt like we were walking on a very narrow path, and it easily could have slid into a very jingoistic or self-pitying or, rah-rah type of memorial. And there were certainly people pushing the project in that direction. So being able to hold on to the ideas and to let go of the specificity of we're going to use this type of concrete and we'll have a joint every 20 feet, which in many ways is almost like a security blanket as a designer, because you can retreat into the realm that you're comfortable in, rather than engaging in others. And so I think I learned a lot from that process, and I had the opportunity to come back to it a few years later, because the memorial does not acknowledge, or did not acknowledge at the time, any of the people who perished from 9/11 related illnesses. It only acknowledged the people who died that day. And the number of people who've died, recovery workers, neighborhood residents, kids from schools nearby that have contracted various diseases, is going to be larger than the number of people that actually perished on that day. And so we were able to come back and add to the memorial another element called the memorial glade that does not list people by name, but acknowledges those deaths in another way. And that was emerged from multiple conversations with stakeholders before we had any clue of what it would look like. So in some ways we had to find a way to add to the memorial without subtracting from it.
Yeah, I think we often forget architecture can be and is this living, breathing thing. This is such a great example of that. Della, could you add to that a little bit? How do you think about the role of the designer?
Yeah, I very much agree, and I appreciate this ability to revisit and reconfigure, because I think that the role of designer is one to set a process. You set and hold a process for something long enough for something honest to come through. And in the realm of a community-informed or community-centered designer, that process is a constant negotiation. And sitting in the position that I do, which is often in between institution and community, policymaker, funder, and community, descendant community elder, and Gen Z community descendant, right? And there are all these different perspectives and motivations and ways of seeing and being in the world. And our job is to hold space. And so I think that there's so many different types of designers that situate around a memorial project, or even the process of governing ourselves as people. What we are defining is a process of integrity, and going back to establishing those values and bringing us back to those values when we start to run astray or find a tense moment, or come into contact with folks who have a different perspective or point of view. How do we center back on those values being tantamount? And something that's embedded into the Underground Railroad Memorial, and also that Michael just spoke of as well, is this temporal nature. So we're looking at also temporary exhibitions. How do we allow for this memorial space to live and breathe over time? And recognizing that, hey, if we were to just establish a singular built structure at a moment in time in the year of 2026, that may not serve us well 60, 70, 100, 300 years from now, and creating a space for us to be able to move with emergence through that design process over time beyond our generations is really important.
It's a good segue for where I want to kind of wrap our conversation today, which is, I'd like to tie it back to Noguchi. We're here at the High Museum. There's this incredible exhibition that I spent a long time at yesterday. I am not a designer. And I wanted to talk about memorials in Noguchi's life. He, maybe not a lesser known fact, but he was probably one of, if not the most prolific memorial maker of the 20th century, certainly up there, and designed multiple, I think it was roughly around 15 memorials in his lifetime, 5 of which were actually realized. For him, they were this way of embracing and kind of contending with the complexity and contradiction he felt within himself as a Japanese American. And I think for him, they were also these really democratic acts of unforgetting. They were a way for all of us to come together in a way. I think the memorials he designed that really show how he embraced contradiction, it wasn't just within himself. He did a memorial to Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia that is, in essence, also a memorial to American ingenuity, innovation, technology. And on the flip of that, he did the Hiroshima Memorial, which kind of is, a result of all of that ingenuity, innovation, and technology. So he understood kind of how to navigate these sides of himself. And I think understanding this history a bit of Noguchi, I wanted to ask you each how you think about Noguchi's perspective. And I should say here that before we did have this talk, I had written an essay about Noguchi as a memorial maker, which I know they all read.
I guess I have a complicated thought about it. I think on the one hand, I thought your essay was lovely, and I'm very moved by the energy of this person to bear witness and to contend in spatial form with truth and lies. That felt like very beautiful. And I texted you or emailed you about this. That line was like, most of what he did was never made. I also relate to that and think that there's something about the mortality of that and the frailty of it that seems really beautiful. And it also tends against what I think is one of the most destructive things, which is the genius with 1,000 helpers model of public design. And so when I talk about complexity, I didn't see him as a starchitect. I saw him as a human being using his particular gifts to contend with collective realities. And that I could relate to. This sort of, things feel frail, identity feels complicated, psychologically we're all over the place. Some of what we do works, some of it doesn't work. Some of it is our fault, some of it is other people's fault. That is where I found the most inspiration in Noguchi. It wasn't like, man, I totally dig this design. I may or may not, but that wasn't the point for me. The point for me was the brokenheartedness and the courage that persisted in the midst of it, and that was embedded in contingency with other people, and that felt like, that's the thing. That's how I want to do it, and I don't want to be a part of the genius with 1,000 helpers model, being neither a genius or a helper. I don't want to do that. And he showed a way that let go of control, that let go of demands, and that feels to me a necessary moral dimension of this creative act.
Yeah, I think I really most resonate with this kind of duality of persona, of this inside-outside vantage point, this not being Japanese enough, not being American enough, and what does that mean for your validity or the ability for a public to validate your credibility. And I sit with that as an African American that has truly no real allegiance as an American. That sense of my identity is something that's very uncomfortable for me. And so even in being involved, I work domestically, but I also work internationally, and I find myself in international contexts. It's a part of my identity that is not something I feel very confident about. When I look at it from my Black American perspective, I am extremely proud. When I look at it as a generic American, it's not something that I feel very good in, especially representing that identity globally. And so sitting in that weirdness of it's a double consciousness and then some, and it's what does that mean to now represent and be a part of a design team that's seeking to articulate a national narrative in a way that I even personally have conflict with, right? And I think that is the reality of being a Black woman in this space. I think that's the reality of also doing what I can in my power to speak truth to power while also sitting with the dualities of my identity and existence. So I really appreciate it and resonate with him on that.
I would have loved to have met him. You know, like you have these heroes that you almost fear to meet, like Mies or Corbusier or something like that. But then somebody like Noguchi felt like somebody that I could have a meaningful conversation, in part because of that sort of blurry sense of identity and belonging. And I think he came from a period that in some ways was utopian and thought that, you know, that we all share something, that there are sort of human, universal characteristics of empathy and belonging and connecting that I hope still have validity and currency, even though we seem to try and divide ourselves into smaller and smaller identity groups.
Well, that's all the time we have, but thank you all so much. So meaningful.